Have you ever spent like an entire evening just agonizing over a meeting?
Oh, absolutely. Too many times.
Right. You know the exact feeling. You were sitting on your couch, maybe staring blankly at the wall and drafting these elaborate, multi-layered mental apologies.
Yeah, for mistakes you haven't even made yet.
Exactly. Mistakes that haven't happened. Your heart is actually racing. Your stomach is in knots. You are entirely convinced, like down to your bones, that tomorrow morning is going to be an absolute unmitigated catastrophe.
And then the actual meeting happens.
And it's completely ordinary. Boring, even.
Right. I mean, you survived the disaster, but the disaster only ever existed in your head. The real tragedy isn't the meeting. It's the Tuesday night you completely threw away.
Which brings us to the core of today's deep dive. We are looking at a text that argues this kind of evening isn't just, a quirky personality trait or a mild inconvenience.
No, it's a massive tax.
It really is. It is a massive hidden tax on your life. So we are exploring the hidden mechanics of worry, the quantifiable productivity costs of anxiety, and the fundamental mindset shift required to conquer it.
And we're pulling all of this from some incredible insights in the book, The Art of Worrying, As Worrier by Naresh J. Jain.
Okay, let's unpack this, because early on in the source text, there is a quote that just hits so incredibly close to home.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
Yeah, Jane writes, "My mind doesn't solve problems at night. It auditions disasters." I mean, what a perfect distillation of how our brains trick us.
It really is.
Tricks us into thinking that lying awake in a cold sweat is somehow like a productive, responsible use of our time.
Yeah, it's a brilliant framing because it exposes the core illusion of worry. We tend to view worry purely through the lens of emotion, right? Like a feeling of being uneasy or stressed.
Right, just a bad feeling.
Right. But Jane forces us to look at the math. If we look at the data, worry is a quantifiable drain on our waking hours. The source material highlights a really striking Gallup study on this exact phenomenon.
Okay, what did they find?
They found that highly anxious employees lose an average of 4.7 hours of productive work per week.
Wait, 4.7 hours.
Almost 5 hours, yes.
Let's just pause on that number for a second.
Hmm.
That is more than half a workday every single week, just gone.
Yep.
I mean, if you extrapolate that out over a year, you are losing nearly 250 hours of your life.
Vanished into thin air.
Yeah.
And it's crucial to understand that they aren't losing that time to actual emergencies.
Right.
They aren't putting out real, tangible fires in the office. They are losing it to the imagination. They're losing it to staring at a screen while replaying a difficult conversation that hasn't happened.
Or like bracing for criticism that might never materialize.
Exactly. Jane calls this working the ghost shift.
The ghost shift. Man, that is wonderfully eerie. But it makes you wonder. If nothing bad actually happens, why does our brain keep forcing us to sit through these mental horror movies?
What's fascinating here is the biological reason behind this exhaustion. You are working a full day mentally battling a disaster that never actually clocks in.
Right.
But your body is entirely unaware that it's a simulation. The human nervous system is an incredibly sophisticated piece of machinery, but it has a major glaring blind spot.
Which is,
It cannot easily distinguish between a real physical threat in the room with you and an imagined threat playing out vividly in your mind's eye.
oh, wow. So if I'm sitting in my safe, quiet living room, but I am vividly imagining my boss yelling at me tomorrow,
Yeah.
my amygdala, like the fear center of my brain, sounds the alarm just as loudly as if a tiger just walked through the front door.
Exactly that. The physiological cascade is identical. The body tightens up. Your breathing becomes shallow. Cortisol, yes. The primary stress hormone floods your bloodstream, your heart rate variability drops, and your sleep architecture is fundamentally disturbed.
Meaning you aren't getting the deep restorative REM sleep you actually need.
Right. You are waking up with a genuine cognitive deficit. You are getting physically, biochemically exhausted from a battle that never takes place. There is a great line in the text that summarizes the sheer waste of this.
Oh, I love this line.
Worry is a tax you pay on a problem that may never arrive.
This is like paying an exorbitant premium for car insurance on a vehicle you don't even own.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Just in case you buy one tomorrow and immediately crash it. It makes absolutely no financial sense. It bankrupts your resources, and yet we do it with our mental energy every single day.
It's a complete misallocation of resources. You are bankrupting your energy reserves for a hypothetical scenario. But recognizing that it is biologically useless and incredibly taxing doesn't just instantly cure us.
Unfortunately.
Right, like if it costs us almost 5 hours a week, why can't we just flip a switch and turn it off?
Because it wears a disguise. Worry is, it's the ultimate con artist. It dresses up in a suit and tie and introduces itself as responsibility.
Yes. Responsibility.
We use all these incredibly reasonable-sounding justifications. We tell ourselves, I'm just being careful, or I'm just thinking ahead,
We desperately want to feel prepared.
right? So we accept the anxiety as the cost of doing business in a complex world.
And that is the trap. The book makes a razor-sharp distinction between actual preparation and what is essentially just rehearsing pain. We confuse the two constantly.
Let's dig into that mechanism.
Yeah.
Because the source has another brilliant quote to illustrate this difference. It says, "You didn't prepare for the storm, you rehearsed the thunder."
Oh, that's such a powerful distinction because preparation is practical and, more importantly, it is finite. It produces capability.
Okay, so what does preparation look like then?
Preparation asks grounding objective questions like, what is the real measurable risk here? And what is the very next practical step I can take within my control?
Like boarding up the windows, buying batteries, or, in a work context, double-checking the financial figures before a presentation.
Yes, exactly. But rehearsal, which is what worry actually is, produces emotional fatigue, not capability. Rehearsal asks unanswerable questions.
Like, what if absolutely everything fails?
Right, or what if I'm just not smart enough to handle the fallout? Preparation says, I have done what I can and I am ready if needed. Rehearsal says, I am going to make myself suffer right now, just in case.
Hold on, though. I have to challenge this premise.
Okay, go for it.
Because if our ancestors hadn't anticipated the worst, they would have been eaten by predators.
Right.
Isn't a certain level of paranoia literally the reason humans have survived this long?
It's a fair point.
Right. So how do you, as a listener, trying to navigate a genuinely unpredictable world, draw the line between a healthy risk assessment and simply rehearsing pain?
That is the vital question, and it's where the nuance of Jane's framework really matters. The distinction lies in the ability to rest.
The ability to rest?
Yeah. Healthy risk assessment, like our ancestors scanning the horizon for predators, is tied to action. You assess the risk, you put a mitigation plan in place, and then you rest.
You go back to foraging or building or living.
Exactly. The line is drawn at the point of action. Rehearsing pain, however, is infinite. It is an endless loop of vigilance where no amount of planning ever lets you turn off the internal alarm system. Readiness without rest doesn't make you safe, it just builds a prison.
Which leads perfectly into what the author calls worry's elegant lie.
Yes.
Because when the storm doesn't hit, when Wednesday turns out to be just a totally fine, boring Wednesday, worry does this incredibly sneaky, manipulative thing.
Yeah.
It takes the credit.
The cognitive bias at play here is fascinating. You spend all Tuesday in a state of sheer panic about Wednesday. Then Wednesday arrives and everything goes smoothly.
Right.
Instead of your brain saying, wow, I wasted all of Tuesday for absolutely no reason, your brain's reward system kicks in.
You get that hit of relief.
You get a massive dopamine hit of relief, and your brain incorrectly associates that feeling of safety with the act of worrying you did the day before. The internal narrative becomes, see, because you stayed on high alert, because you agonized over every detail, you kept us safe.
It promotes anxiety to a guardian role.
Exactly.
It's like wearing a necklace made of garlic every single day, never getting attacked by a vampire, and concluding that the garlic is the only thing keeping you alive in this city.
That is a great analogy.
Right. You never actually test the alternative.
Yeah.
You just keep buying more garlic. You start trusting your fear more than you trust the actual evidence in front of you.
That is a phenomenal way to picture it. You become dependent on the talisman of your own anxiety. As Jane writes, peace begins the moment worry stops taking credit for safety. Until you break that false association, you will always feel like relaxing is dangerous.
But realizing that worry is a biological illusion built on a cognitive bias doesn't just instantly free us from it, does it?
No, it really doesn't.
Because once we completely dismantle the logic of worry, we still have to confront something much deeper. We have to acknowledge why it's so incredibly hard to let it go. And the painful truth is, it usually stems from love.
It does. It's so important not to demonize the instinct itself. Jane is very clear that worry isn't always irrational or malicious. More often than not, it comes from a deeply sincere desire to protect the things and the people that matter most to us.
Of course, parents worry about their children because they love them fiercely.
And the thought of them getting hurt is unbearable. Leaders worry about their teams because they feel a profound, genuine sense of accountability. You worry about your career because you want to provide a stable life for your family.
The root is care. But here's where it gets really interesting. The profound, tragic irony is that the very thing we do, because we care so deeply about our loved ones, is the exact mechanism that pulls us away from being present with them.
The tragedy of stolen presence. The cost of worry isn't just the 4.7 hours of lost workplace productivity. It's the moments of your actual, irreplaceable life that get hijacked.
Yeah.
You might be sitting at the dinner table with your family, physically occupying a chair, but emotionally, cognitively, you are 1,000 miles away, fighting a phantom problem in tomorrow's schedule.
It inserts itself into joy. That is the cruelest part. You'll be having a perfect Sunday afternoon, the weather is beautiful, everyone is laughing, and worry just taps you on the shoulder and whispers, yeah, but how long is this really going to last?
What about that email you haven't answered?
Right. As the source notes, worry loves a good horror movie, especially when it writes the script. It interrupts our connection, our gratitude, our sleep. You become a ghost in your own life.
And that is precisely why recognizing the root of care is the key to dismantling it. When we realize that our worry is just love that has lost its way, we can start to redirect it with compassion instead of frustration.
Yeah.
The goal isn't to stop caring.
No, not at all.
The goal is to stop the chronic fear from stealing the very life you are trying so hard to protect.
Okay, so we understand the biological cost. We understand the cognitive trap of the elegant lie. And we understand the emotional root. But how do we actually execute the pivot?
Well, the source material provides a very clear framework for this mindset shift.
Moving from what the author calls a worrier to a warrior. And to understand why this framework is so effective, I think we have to look at the author himself, Naresh J. Jain, because his background is wildly unique.
His resume gives these frameworks immense credibility. Jain isn't just a philosopher theorizing from a quiet retreat. He has over 29 years of intense, high-stakes corporate leadership experience.
Wow.
Specifically, he is a chartered accountant who headed up compliance and worker welfare for the government body delivering the stadium infrastructure for the FIFA World Cup Qatar 2022.
I mean, just visualizing the scale of that is mind-boggling. 8 world-class stadiums, millions of workers, billions of dollars, an unmovable global deadline, with the eyes of the entire world watching. If anyone knows the difference between real systematic preparation and panicked, useless rehearsal, it is someone managing human capital and compliance on a project of that sheer magnitude.
Absolutely.
You can't just worry a stadium into existence. You have to execute.
You have to rely on systems, not anxiety. He brings this intense corporate discipline and focus on objective reality. But what makes his approach so holistic is what he blends that corporate discipline with.
Right, because it's not just corporate.
No, he is also a certified life coach with a deep, active interest in esoteric and occult sciences.
Right. The text mentions his studies in numerology, astrology, palmistry, and things like Vastu and Feng Shui.
Yeah.
For listeners who might not be familiar, Vastu is a traditional Indian architectural system, similar in some ways to Feng Shui, focused on harmonizing buildings with nature, using geometric patterns and ancient texts to create balance.
It is a remarkable duality. He approaches the human mind with the rigor of a chartered accountant who needs everything to balance, but with the spiritual understanding that humans are not machines.
We are spirits that need to be grounded in our environment.
Exactly. This blend of the highly tangible and the highly intangible deeply informs the core contrast he draws between the worrier and the warrior.
So let's define those two paradigms. What is the fundamental difference in how they operate?
Well, the warrior's entire operating system is based on the illusion of control. Their goal is to achieve absolute certainty before they allow themselves to feel peace.
They live entirely in the what if.
Yes, they believe that if they just anticipate every possible disaster, every potential failure, they can somehow control the future.
Which is a fool's errand, because life is inherently unpredictable.
Precisely the point. The warrior, on the other hand, accepts that uncertainty is a fundamental condition of life. They don't deny that the future is unknown and potentially dangerous. They simply refuse to be ruled by that fact.
They focus on what is rather than what if.
Exactly. They realize the only thing they truly have dominion over is their own immediate response.
So let's make this actionable. Let's go back to our listener from the very beginning of the show, sitting on the couch on a Tuesday night, heart racing, terrified about the Wednesday morning meeting.
Okay.
When they feel themselves slipping into that ghost shift, Jain outlines 3 specific questions to ask to snap back into the warrior mindset. Question number 1, is this real or imagined?
It sounds deceptively simple, but neurologically it is a powerful interrupt. When you ask, is this real or imagined? You force your brain's prefrontal cortex to come online and look for objective evidence.
Which immediately dampens the panic response of the amygdala.
Precisely.
So applying it to our scenario, is the boss actually mad at me right now?
No.
No. Have they sent an angry email? No.
Correct.
Is the meeting real? Yes. Is the disaster real? No. It's imagined.
Exactly. If it's real, like if you truly forgot to prepare the presentation, then you focus on the very next step to fix it. If it's imagined, if you are just guessing that people will judge you, you have to consciously label it as an illusion. You stop feeding it oxygen.
Which leads right into question number 2. Is there something useful I can do right now?
This pulls you out of cognitive paralysis and pushes you back into agency. If there's a useful action, you take it immediately, review your notes for 10 minutes, iron your shirt, set your alarm.
But if the answer is no?
If it is 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday and there's literally nothing you can do until the meeting starts at 9:00 a.m., you have to consciously practice releasing the grip.
Which brings us to the final question, and the one that I think requires the most brutal honesty. Am I preparing or punishing myself?
This raises an important question about our cultural conditioning. As we discussed earlier, we have been conditioned to view our own suffering as a metric of our dedication.
Yeah, we think if we aren't losing sleep over a problem, we don't care enough about our job or our kids or our future.
We use anxiety as a twisted badge of honor. Look how much I'm worrying. I must be a really responsible employee.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that way.
But the warrior understands that punishing yourself in advance does not change the outcome of the meeting. It only guarantees that you show up to the meeting already exhausted.
The warrior acts. The warrior spirals.
Yes. The warrior asks, what is needed from me right now? The warrior asks, what might break tomorrow?
It is a total paradigm shift. It is about reclaiming your energy from the ghost shift. So what does this all mean? For you, listening right now, taking this all in,
It means realizing the incredible stakes of this mental habit.
it's about reclaiming those 4.7 lost hours every single week. But far more importantly, it's about reclaiming your seat at the dinner table, reclaiming your ability to enjoy a Sunday afternoon without the looming shadow of Monday morning, reclaiming your presence in your own life.
The ultimate goal of this deep dive isn't to tell you to stop caring. Care is beautiful. And it certainly isn't to tell you to stop planning for your future.
Definitely not.
The goal is to invite you to stop living in the rehearsal room. You have the capacity to learn how to stand in the unknown, to look at the unpredictability of tomorrow without collapsing under the weight of it today.
Which brings up a final, really provocative thought to leave you with, building on the biology we discussed earlier. We talked about how the human nervous system is easily tricked, how it doesn't know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one.
Right, the blind spot.
That's the blind spot that causes the exhaustion of the ghost shift. But if vividly rehearsing a disaster creates real physical exhaustion and real cortisol, could you hack that biological loophole in reverse?
Ooh, that is an interesting idea.
Right. If you spend your evening actively, vividly rehearsing success, or rehearsing a feeling of deep peace, or rehearsing your own absolute resilience, could you actually trick your body into feeling genuine physical courage before you even step into the room?
It is a fascinating inversion of the very mechanism that causes us so much grief. What if we use the imagination as an intentional tool for biological grounding, rather than a runaway train of panic?
Think about that the next time you find yourself spending an entire evening agonizing over a totally ordinary meeting. You have the power to change the script. You don't have to audition the disaster. You can just wait for the curtain to rise.